At midnight she was there, by dawn she was gone. Welcome to Crimson Whisper. I am your host Bramwell. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love reading them all. Now let's follow the trail of clues. It was a chill evening in late October when the news arrived at 221B Baker Street. The fog had rolled in from the Thames, draping the city in a heavy, spectral blanket. The gas lamps cast long shadows along the cobbled streets, and the sound of carriage wheels creaking over the stone echoed faintly in the distance. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair by the fire, his sharp eyes peering over the latest newspaper with a faint air of boredom. I, as always, was at his side, carefully noting the details of his habitual restlessness. "Watson," he said suddenly, lowering the paper, "there is something afoot tonight, though I am not yet certain what." His words were as dispassionate as ever, but I could sense that some subtle shift had caught his attention. I glanced up from my notes, awaiting an explanation. At that very moment, a sharp rap at the door announced the arrival of a visitor. Mrs. Hudson, our long-time landlady, entered swiftly, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling, "there's been an urgent matter at the Hargrave residence. The maid, Miss Emily Dawson, has vanished. Disappeared without a trace in the dead of night. They've already called upon Scotland Yard, but they suspect foul play. They need you there immediately." Holmes stood, his keen mind already whirring through the possibilities. His sharp eyes studied Mrs. Hudson for a brief moment, then turned to me. "Watson, you shall accompany me. I trust your discretion in such matters, and I am certain your presence will aid the investigation." We hurried to the Hargrave mansion, a grand affair on the edge of Westminster. The house stood silent under the oppressive fog, an imposing edifice that looked more like a fortress than a home. Inside we were greeted by Lord and Lady Hargrave, a stately couple who seemed more concerned with appearances than the well-being of their staff. Lord Hargrave, a man of perhaps 50 years, with a well-groomed moustache and a frown that seemed permanently etched upon his face, led us to the drawing-room. His wife, a woman of striking beauty and much younger than her husband, appeared equally distressed but also strangely composed, as though she were used to such disruptions. "It's most unlike Emily to simply vanish," Lady Hargrave said, her voice smooth but laced with a tension that was hard to ignore. "She was our maid for over 3 years, always so punctual, so dependable. Have the police searched the house thoroughly?" Holmes asked, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Indeed they have. They found nothing unusual, save for a few strange marks on the carpet near her room, as if she had been dragged away. Her belongings are gone. Clothes, personal effects, even her shoes. It's as though she evaporated into the night." Holmes's sharp gaze turned to me, his thoughts already churning. "Tell me, Lord Hargrave, were there any recent tensions within the household? Any reason for Miss Dawson to abscond in such a manner?" Lord Hargrave's lips tightened, his gaze flickering briefly toward his wife. "Nothing of consequence, Mr. Holmes. Emily was always a quiet, obedient girl. No history of conflict, no issues with the staff." Holmes looked up at me. "It is curious, Watson. A maid who vanishes without a word, leaving behind nothing but strange marks and an unsettling silence. The first question we must answer is this: why?" We were led to the maid's room, a small, tidy affair at the end of a narrow hallway. The scene was as expected. No signs of struggle, just a bed, a small wardrobe, and a single window that opened to the fog-filled night. Yet something was out of place. A faint, almost imperceptible stain marred the edge of the rug by the bed, as though something heavy had been dragged across it. Holmes knelt down, inspecting the mark with a magnifying glass, his fingers lightly brushing the surface. "This stain," he murmured, "was made by a heavy object, likely dragged with some force. But the absence of blood is most unusual. I suspect the marks were made by something other than a human." "Holmes, do you think someone else is involved?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "Quite possibly, Watson," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of intrigue. "There is something deeply wrong about this case. The maid's disappearance is only the beginning. There is more at play here than meets the eye." As Holmes stood, his gaze turned toward the window, eyes narrowing as if he could see through the fog to something far beyond the ordinary. "We must learn more about the people who inhabit this house, Watson. The truth, I suspect, is hidden within the walls of Hargrave Manor. And we are merely scratching the surface, and with that we set to work, delving into the lives of the Hargraves and their staff. uncovering secrets that would soon lead us into the heart of a mystery far more tangled than either of us could have predicted. The game was afoot. As Holmes examined the faint stain on the rug, I couldn't help but wonder what he saw that I did not. There was something in the air, a sense of unease that seemed to seep from the very walls of the Hargrave mansion. We had already spoken with Lord and Lady Hargrave, but there were still many pieces of the puzzle left scattered about. Holmes remained composed, his mind already working in overdrive as he stood and motioned for me to follow him. "We must speak with the staff," he said, his voice low but firm. "A household is a reflection of its inhabitants, and their employees know far more than they let on. It is time to see what secrets they keep." We left the maid's room, and as we passed down the dim hallway, I couldn't help but notice the silence of the house. It was unsettling in its stillness, as though the mansion itself were holding its breath. As I followed Holmes down the staircase, my mind racing with the possibilities. The housekeeper, Mrs. Forsyth, was an elderly woman with a sharp gaze and a stern manner. She greeted us in the kitchen, where the aroma of freshly brewed tea hung in the air. Her eyes flickered with a mix of suspicion and curiosity as Holmes introduced himself. "Mrs. Forsyth, I trust you are acquainted with Miss Dawson," Holmes began, his tone polite yet direct. "Can you tell us anything unusual about her behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance?" She set the kettle down with a sharp clink, her hands steady despite the question. "Nothing out of the ordinary, Mr. Holmes. Emily was always punctual and respectful. If there was anything amiss, I would have noticed. But you did notice something, didn't you?" Holmes pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. Mrs. Forsyth hesitated, her lips pressing together in a thin line before she spoke again. "Well, now that you mention it, there was something peculiar. Emily had been distracted for the past week or so. She wasn't herself, and she would often slip away from the rest of the staff to take long walks in the garden, even when there was work to be done." "Long walks?" I asked, intrigued. "Did she speak with anyone during these walks?" "I couldn't say, Dr. Watson," she replied, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But there was one evening just 2 nights ago when I saw her speaking with a man in the garden. He was tall, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now that you mention it, it seems odd." Holmes's eyes lit up with interest. "A man, you say? And did you catch a glimpse of his face?" Mrs. Forsyth shook her head. "No, Mr. Holmes, the garden was quite dark, and he was facing away from me. But his posture, there was something about him, something that made me uneasy." "Thank you, Mrs. Forsyth," Holmes said, his voice soft but tinged with gratitude. "You've given us valuable information." As we left the kitchen, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the mystery deepening. The mention of a stranger, someone whom Emily had conversed with in secret, was a crucial detail. Could this be the key to unraveling the case? And if so, who was this man and what role had he played in her disappearance? We turned our attention to the other staff members, questioning the butler, the footman, and the other maids. Each person had their own small piece of the puzzle, but nothing truly conclusive emerged. It was only when we spoke with the stable boy, a nervous young lad named Thomas, that we received a new lead. "I saw Miss Dawson the night she disappeared," Thomas said, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "She was leaving the back door around midnight, carrying a small bag. She was heading toward the alley behind the house, and there was a carriage waiting for her. I didn't know who was inside, but I saw the driver. He had a strange look about him. He wore a heavy cloak, and his face was hidden beneath the hood. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now it seems wrong." Holmes's expression hardened as he processed the boy's words. "A carriage at midnight?" "This is becoming more complicated by the minute, Watson. It seems Miss Dawson was not only meeting someone, but she had arranged to leave the house in secret. The question now is why." I could see that Holmes was already formulating a theory, though he kept it to himself for the moment. "Thomas," he said, his voice steady, "did you happen to notice any marks or signs near the back door? Anything out of place?" The stable boy shook his head. "No, sir, nothing that stood out. But I do remember hearing something strange, like a low voice calling her name just before she left. I didn't think to follow her, though, not with the hour being so late." "Very well," Holmes replied, his mind clearly racing. "You've given us much to consider. Thank you, Thomas." As we stepped outside into the now cold, foggy night, Holmes turned to me, his mind clearly consumed by the new developments. "Watson, it seems we have a far more intricate case on our hands than I had anticipated. There is more at work here than just a simple disappearance. We must tread carefully and continue to gather information. I suspect the truth lies somewhere in the shadows, but I cannot yet say where." We stood in the damp air, the mist swirling around us like a veil, and Holmes began to walk toward the far side of the estate. I followed closely, my thoughts tangled with the mystery. The maid had vanished into the night, but there was something far darker at play. We had yet to uncover the full extent of the truth, and the deeper we dug, the more tangled the web became. The air was thick with fog as we made our way toward the far side of the estate, Holmes' mind whirring as he sifted through the various pieces of information we had gathered. It seemed as though the more we uncovered, the deeper the mystery grew. A maid who disappeared without a trace, a mysterious man in the garden, and a secret midnight rendezvous. Each detail led to another, but none seemed to offer the clarity we sought. Holmes stopped abruptly, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. He took in the sprawling grounds of Hargrave Manor, the stables tucked away to the left, the overgrown hedges of the garden, and the distant, looming silhouette of the house. He looked as though he were mentally retracing the maid's last steps, as if trying to piece together the path she had taken. "It seems, Watson, that we are missing something vital," he said, his voice low but certain. "There are no signs of force at the back door, no trace of the carriage's departure. We know she left, but how? And why?" I stood silently watching him, knowing that he was already several steps ahead of me. His mind, ever sharp, had likely already deduced more than he was willing to share. As if reading my thoughts, he continued, "The carriage. There's something about that carriage that doesn't sit well with me. A midnight departure, a hidden driver, and a maid who was perfectly content to leave her duties without a word. It is not the actions of someone fleeing. No, it suggests something much more calculated. But what of the man she spoke to in the garden?" I asked, still piecing together the significance of that brief encounter. Could he be connected to the carriage? Holmes did not respond immediately, his gaze now fixed on the stable in the distance. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "It's possible," he said, his voice thoughtful. "But we must first consider another angle, her personal life. A maid would not typically arrange a secret meeting unless she had some motivation, some reason to go to such lengths." I nodded, understanding the implication. Holmes was suggesting that Miss Dawson's disappearance was not just a random act of escape, but something far more deliberate. But what could possibly motivate a young woman to leave the safety of her post in such a clandestine manner? "Watson, I believe it is time to speak with Miss Dawson's closest confidants," Holmes said suddenly, his tone snapping my thoughts back into focus. "We need to know more about her life, her relationships. If she were involved with someone, it is likely they were someone within the household or someone she trusted." We made our way to the servants' quarters, where the staff lived and worked. There was a distinct separation between the world of the Hargraves and the world of their employees, and it was here in these modest quarters that we hoped to uncover more. Inside the common room, we found a few of the other maids sitting quietly, the air thick with whispered conversations. As we entered, their conversations ceased and all eyes turned to us. The room was small, poorly lit, with a few humble chairs and a table cluttered with half-finished meals and dishes. Holmes wasted no time. "Ladies, I regret to trouble you, but we must speak of Emily Dawson. We have reason to believe that her disappearance was not an accident, and we need your assistance." There was a murmur among the group, and one of the maids, a young woman named Clara, stood up hesitantly. She was a slender girl with dark, anxious eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the intrusion. "Miss Dawson." "She was a quiet one," Clara began, her voice soft. "But she was friendly enough. She would often speak of a man, someone who had been coming to visit her for the past few weeks. She never told us his name, but I overheard her mention him in passing. He was always asking her to meet him in secret, to go away somewhere with him. Did she seem fond of him?" I asked, watching Clara closely. Her hands twisted in her lap as she avoided my gaze. "I think so," Clara replied, her voice shaky. "She seemed different when she spoke of him, happy almost. But she didn't want to share much. She would get quiet, and sometimes she would look out the window like she was waiting for someone. Holmes looked over at me, his expression unreadable. There was something in the way Clara spoke, something uncertain but significant. I could tell Holmes was already making connections in his mind, though he kept them to himself. "You said she mentioned meeting him in secret," Holmes continued. "Did she ever tell you where or when these meetings would take place?" Clara shook her head. "No, sir. She was always very secretive about it. But once, when I was cleaning the windows, I saw her talking to a man outside. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, and I could swear I've seen him standing near the garden a few times. I never spoke to him, but it was clear that he wasn't a servant." This new piece of information seemed to hit Holmes like a revelation. "The garden again," he murmured, his mind no doubt jumping to conclusions. He turned to me, his eyes bright with understanding. "Watson, it seems our mystery man has made his presence known once more, but this time I believe we have a clearer picture of him. We must investigate further." And with that, Holmes moved swiftly, his mind already consumed by the next step of the investigation. The maid's disappearance was becoming less of a mystery about a missing person and more of a question of motive, identity, and hidden connections. We were edging closer to the truth, but the path ahead was still shrouded in fog, and the answers we sought were buried deeper than we had yet imagined. The quiet hum of the house seemed to grow louder as we made our way back to the estate's garden. Holmes, unusually thoughtful, led the way without a word, his mind clearly consumed by the new revelations. The mention of the man in the garden had shifted something in him. I could see the flicker of excitement in his eyes, the spark of his mind latching onto a new thread to pull. "I believe," he said after a moment of silence, "that we are not merely dealing with a missing maid, Watson. We are investigating a far more intricate plot, one involving carefully hidden motives and dangerous secrets." I glanced over at him, waiting for him to elaborate, but he remained quiet, his thoughts racing ahead of mine. We reached the garden's edge, where the ground softened underfoot, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Holmes stopped near a row of hedges that bordered the manor, the same place where Miss Dawson had reportedly spoken to the mysterious man. "There are two things that don't add up," Holmes continued, his voice low but intense. "First, why would she leave so suddenly in the dead of night with only a small bag? And second, why the secrecy around this man?" I was about to ask what he thought the answer might be when something caught my attention, a faint glimmer of light near the hedge. It was barely perceptible, but it drew me toward it. I followed the faint trail of light, and there, hidden in the underbrush, I found a small crumpled piece of paper. Holmes immediately knelt beside me, his face lighting up with recognition. "Ah, Watson, this is precisely what we needed," he said, his fingers deftly unrolling the paper. It was a small folded note, the ink smudged slightly by the dampness, but legible nonetheless. Holmes read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Meet me at midnight. The garden. Don't let anyone see you. It's time to leave. It's time to leave." His brow furrowed as he examined the note more closely. It seems Miss Dawson was indeed planning to leave with someone. But the timing, midnight, is highly suspicious. The secrecy, the mention of escape, it all suggests something more than a simple desire to run away. I nodded, though the weight of the situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. "You think she was coerced?" "It's possible," Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. "But there's another possibility. This note may not have been written by Miss Dawson at all. It could have been forged, someone framing her actions. The timing, the location, all seem too convenient. I suspect our mystery man is more involved in this than we have considered." We turned back toward the house, Holmes' mind racing, the wheels of his deductions spinning with newfound clarity. He had already formed a theory, one that I knew would unravel the case in a way we had yet to anticipate. But first we needed to gather more information, more evidence to confirm our suspicions. Our next stop was the library, a vast room lined with rows of dusty books. The atmosphere in here was heavy, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of generations. Lord Hargrave had mentioned earlier that his family's lineage was one steeped in wealth and old connections. It was clear, however, that he was more interested in preserving his status than in the well-being of his staff. Holmes wasted no time in approaching the desk where the family papers were kept. He scanned the titles quickly, his eyes flicking over several old leather-bound volumes before selecting one. He opened it carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages until he found what he was looking for. "Ah," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to me. "This should prove most enlightening." I leaned over, intrigued. "What is it?" Holmes held up the page, pointing to a name printed in bold letters. "Lydia Hargrave." "Lydia Hargrave," he repeated. "Lord Hargrave's niece, I would assume. And why is this important?" I asked, still unsure of where Holmes was leading us. "Because," he said, turning the page with deliberate precision, "this Lydia Hargrave, it seems, had a very close relationship with Miss Dawson, perhaps even more than the Hargraves would have liked to admit. Look here, Watson, at this correspondence." The letter was carefully tucked within the family records, dated just a few days before Miss Dawson's disappearance. Holmes held the letter out for me to read. "My dearest Emily, I know you are conflicted, but this is the only way forward. We have both suffered enough, and it's time we made our escape. I'll meet you tonight, as planned. We'll leave together, for good. Forever yours, Lydia." The realization hit me with a jolt, a spark of understanding igniting in my mind. Holmes had been right all along. There was more to this than just a maid vanishing under strange circumstances. This was a love story, a forbidden one. The note, the secret meetings in the garden, the midnight escape, it all pointed to one thing. Miss Dawson had been in love with Lydia Hargrave, and together they had planned to flee the confines of their respective roles. Holmes closed the letter carefully and looked up at me. "It seems, Watson, that we now understand the motive. But we are still left with one crucial question. Why didn't Miss Dawson return? What happened between that fateful night and now?" I felt a chill creep over me. If this was indeed a story of love and escape, then something had gone horribly wrong. But what? And why had Lydia Hargrave, the woman who had been so determined to run away, suddenly turned her back on her lover? There was more to uncover, and I could feel the tension in the air as Holmes's sharp mind began to piece together the final pieces of the puzzle. Holmes closed the family records with a soft, deliberate motion, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hand. The room seemed to shrink in the silence that followed, the weight of his discovery settling over us both. The love affair between Miss Dawson and Lydia Hargrave had been hidden, cloaked in secrecy. But it was clear now that it was not just a romantic escape. It was a rebellion against the rigid walls of class and propriety that had been built around them both. Yet something had gone wrong. Holmes's gaze flickered toward the door, and I could sense his thoughts aligning, his mind already in motion as he pieced together the next move. "Watson, we now know the nature of their relationship," he said, his voice measured, but carrying the quiet excitement of a man nearing the end of a puzzle. "But Lydia Hargrave's role in this still demands further scrutiny. She is the linchpin of this entire case. If Miss Dawson was indeed planning to leave with her, then Lydia's actions that night, and thereafter, are crucial to understanding why things went awry." I nodded, still processing the gravity of what we had uncovered. But why did Lydia seem so distant when we spoke to her earlier? Her composure seemed almost too calculated for someone whose lover had vanished in such a manner. Holmes's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. "That, Watson, is precisely what we must uncover. It's often in the smallest of details, the smallest of silences, that the truth hides." We returned to the main house, and Holmes insisted we speak once more with Lydia, this time without the veil of politeness that had marked our earlier conversation. I felt a pang of discomfort at the thought, but it was clear that Holmes was determined to extract the truth from her, no matter the cost. The moment we entered the drawing room, Lydia Hargrave looked up from her position by the window, where she had been staring out at the dreary sky, her hands folded in her lap. She seemed the picture of elegance, but there was an underlying tension that I hadn't noticed before. "Mr. Holmes," she said smoothly, though her voice betrayed a hint of wariness, "what more is it that you need from me?" Holmes wasted no time. "Lady Hargrave, we are not here to indulge in pleasantries. We know about your relationship with Emily Dawson, and we know about your plans to escape together." Her eyes flickered, but she quickly masked the emotion that had surfaced. "I don't know what you're implying," she said coolly, standing and turning toward the fire, her back to us. "Miss Dawson was a loyal servant. She was nothing more than that." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her as he spoke with quiet precision. "You were planning to leave with her, Lydia. Your letter confirms it. Yet something happened that night. Emily never returned. What went wrong?" For a moment there was no answer. Lydia's back was still turned, and she stood perfectly still, as though she were weighing the decision to come clean or to hold on to her carefully crafted facade. The silence in the room felt as though it could stretch for eternity. Finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "You don't understand, Mr. Holmes. Emily and I were going to escape together. We had been planning it for weeks, months even, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't leave this life behind. I was going to take her with me, yes, but I couldn't bring myself to face the consequences." Holmes took a step forward, his tone softening just enough to reveal a trace of sympathy. "So you changed your mind that night? But why not tell her? Why not simply end the plan? Instead, you left her in the dark. And now she's gone." Lydia turned to face him, her eyes shadowed with a mixture of guilt and regret. "I didn't leave her," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I went to meet her, yes, but when I arrived she was gone. I waited for hours, but she never came. I thought something had gone wrong, that maybe she had realized it was a mistake. Did you see anyone else that night?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp again. Lydia hesitated, her eyes darting briefly toward the door as though she were considering whether or not to say more. Finally she answered in a low voice, "There was someone there, someone waiting in the shadows. I didn't see his face, but I heard him. His voice was low, cold. He told me to leave, to go back inside the house. He said Emily would be fine. But when I tried to approach her hiding place, he stopped me. And that was the last time I saw her." Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing. A man who knew both of you. Did he threaten you?" Lydia shook her head, her expression clouded with confusion. "No, he didn't threaten me. He just commanded me to leave as though he were in control. I didn't understand it then, but now I don't know who he was or why he did that. I never told anyone about it, because I didn't know what to make of it. I thought I had failed her. But I swear, Mr. Holmes, I had no idea what happened to her after that." Holmes's gaze softened, but there was still a spark of something deeper in his eyes, a realization that we had uncovered another key piece of the puzzle. "It seems, Lydia, that we are now faced with another question. Who was this man, and why did he intervene that night?" Lydia, for the first time, seemed genuinely shaken. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But he must have been the one who took her. He must have been the one who ruined everything." Holmes nodded, his mind already moving toward the next step. "We will find him, Lydia, and when we do, the truth will come to light. We left Lydia in her solitude, the weight of her words lingering in the air. There was someone else, someone whose involvement in this case had been hidden in the shadows, and it was clear now that Miss Dawson's disappearance was part of a larger web of intrigue, one that we had only begun to unravel. As we left Lydia standing by the hearth, her words lingering in the room like an unspoken truth, Holmes did not speak immediately. His steps were measured, his mind clearly shifting through the new information we had uncovered. We had learned much, but there was still something elusive about the entire situation, something that seemed to hide just beyond our grasp. "We know now." "Watson," Holmes said quietly as we made our way down the grand staircase, "that Miss Dawson did not vanish by her own will. She was taken, but the question remains, who would want to abduct her and why? Was it someone connected to Lydia, or was it an entirely different party?" I felt the weight of his words pressing against me, the gravity of the situation settling heavily in the pit of my stomach. The man Lydia saw, the one who ordered her to leave, he could be the key. He must have known something about the plans to escape. But why intervene so forcefully? And why would he not take Lydia if she were his target? Holmes paused at the door, his fingers resting lightly on the brass handle. "That is precisely what we must determine, Watson. Lydia's involvement complicates the situation, but I suspect our mystery man is someone with a vested interest in keeping the truth buried. The motives are unclear, but the connections are beginning to form." We stepped out into the cool evening air, the fog still clinging to the streets in heavy tendrils. The Hargrave estate was silent, the house looming behind us like a silent sentinel, its windows dark. We had to find the missing link between the Hargraves, their staff, and the mysterious man who seemed to be pulling the strings behind Miss Dawson's disappearance. "The garden—" "Watson," Holmes murmured as we approached the hedge where we had found the letter. "There must be something there we overlooked." Miss Dawson's decision to meet in the garden, why not inside the house where it would have been safer? The answer may be hidden in plain sight. I followed closely, as Holmes moved with purpose toward the overgrown garden, his gaze scanning the area with the intensity of a hawk watching for prey. He crouched near the hedge, running his gloved hands over the foliage, his fingers brushing against the damp earth. I stood at a distance, watching carefully, as the dim light of the street lamps cast long shadows across the grounds. Holmes muttered under his breath, a soft hum of concentration as he examined every inch of the area. His sharp eyes caught something I had missed, a small indentation in the earth near the edge of the garden path. It was faint, but it was there. "Look here, Watson," he said, beckoning me closer. "Do you see that?" I knelt beside him, studying the ground. There was a disturbance in the soil, as though something or someone had recently passed through, leaving behind a subtle but noticeable mark. A footprint, perhaps? Or something more deliberate? Holmes's eyes lit up with understanding. "This, Watson, is the first real lead we've had. This mark was made by someone with knowledge of the grounds. The question is, why did they choose this spot?" I could feel the pulse of excitement rising in me as I processed the discovery. We had been so focused on the interpersonal dynamics within the house that we hadn't considered the possibility of someone familiar with the layout using the garden as a rendezvous point. But the footprint was no ordinary sign. It was deliberate and it was fresh. Holmes stood and surveyed the area once more, his mind already making connections. "This footprint is too small to be Lydia's. It belongs to someone else. Someone who knew exactly where to stand, where to hide. It could be the man who took Miss Dawson." I nodded, now fully grasping the significance of the discovery. "So we are looking for someone with intimate knowledge of the Hargrave estate, a person who could move freely, unnoticed." "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice soft but filled with certainty. "And that brings us to our next task. We must identify who that someone is." We continued our investigation, but the search soon led us back to the house, where we decided to question the remaining staff. If we were to uncover any potential links to the mysterious man, it would have to be through the people closest to the Hargraves, those who had access to the property and its secrets. It was time to shift our focus from the grandiose airs of Lord Hargrave and Lydia, and instead examine those who had more freedom to move about without suspicion. Holmes had already turned his attention to the gardener, a man named Henry, who had worked at the estate for several years. His hands were calloused from years of labor, and his weathered face betrayed little of his thoughts. When we approached him, he looked up with a wary expression, but did not try to avoid us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Henry greeted us with a respectful nod. "What brings you back to the garden?" "Henry," Holmes began without preamble, "we are investigating the disappearance of Miss Dawson, and we have reason to believe someone with knowledge of the grounds may be involved. Can you tell us if you saw anyone unusual the night she disappeared? Someone who might have been on the property without permission?" Henry's eyes darted briefly to the ground before he answered. "I didn't see anyone that night, sir, not around the garden. But I do recall hearing something strange. A carriage, perhaps. It was late, but I thought it might have been a visitor of Lord Hargrave. I didn't pay it much mind." "A carriage?" I asked, intrigued. "Can you tell us more about it?" "I can't say for sure, sir," Henry replied, his voice hesitant. "But it was the sound of wheels on the gravel, heavy and slow. It sounded like it was coming from the back, not the front of the house." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And this sound, when did you hear it?" Henry shifted uncomfortably. "It was late, past midnight, I reckon. I was working late, trimming the hedges near the back gate. It's not unusual for Lord Hargrave to have visitors at odd hours, but that night it felt different." Holmes stood still for a moment, piecing the new information together. "A carriage at midnight coming from the back of the house. This corroborates what we've learned so far. The man who took Miss Dawson likely arrived in such a manner." With this new lead in hand, Holmes's mind was already racing ahead. There was one thing clear. The man who had taken Emily Dawson had a plan, and it involved knowledge of the estate and its routines. But the question now was, who was he, and why had he acted so decisively? We were closer to the truth, but the final piece was still out of reach. As we left the gardener, Henry, and his cryptic account of a late-night carriage, the pieces of the puzzle began to align, but only just. We had learned of the mysterious carriage arriving at the back gate, and its timing, right around the moment Miss Dawson disappeared, was far too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. It seemed that every lead we followed led to another layer of mystery, and the deeper we went, the more complex the situation became. Holmes's mind, ever sharp and always alert, was consumed by the details. We had no clear suspect yet, no definitive answer, but the scent of something more sinister lingered in the air. There was an organized, almost calculated quality to everything that had unfolded thus far. Someone with patience and knowledge of the estate was behind Miss Dawson's disappearance, and likely Lydia Hargrave's troubled role in it. But to what end? We returned to the drawing room, where the tension was thick in the air. The grand house felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were complicit in the secrets it held. Holmes didn't speak as he paced the room, his steps measured, his thoughts undoubtedly deep in calculation. "Watson," he said at last, stopping to look at me, his eyes sharp, "we must speak with Lord Hargrave again. His behavior has been peculiar. When we last spoke, he seemed more interested in deflecting suspicion than addressing the facts. It is time we confront him directly." I nodded, sensing the urgency in his tone. Lord Hargrave had played the part of the concerned aristocrat, but something about his responses felt rehearsed. He had avoided answering many of our questions with any real clarity, and it was beginning to feel as though he knew more than he was letting on. We found Lord Hargrave in his study, a room filled with heavy leather-bound volumes and the smell of rich tobacco smoke that lingered in the air. His posture was rigid as he sat behind his desk, a glass of brandy in one hand. He looked up as we entered, his expression guarded but polite. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us with a tight smile, his voice formal. "What can I do for you now? I trust you're no longer under the illusion that my family is involved in this unfortunate business?" Holmes, unfazed by the dismissive tone, stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Lord Hargrave. "Lord Hargrave, we know that Miss Dawson and your niece Lydia had been planning to leave the estate together. You were aware of this, were you not?" Hargrave's face tightened, his fingers clenching around the glass. "I am not sure what you mean, Mr. Holmes. My niece's personal affairs are none of your concern. This matter concerns a maid who chose to leave the house of her own accord. Surely, you have no reason to drag my family into this further. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "I believe you know exactly what I'm referring to, Lord Hargrave. Miss Dawson did not leave voluntarily. She was taken, and I have no doubt that you know more about what happened that night than you've let on." The tension in the room thickened. For a long moment, Hargrave said nothing. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for a way to regain control of the situation. Finally, he exhaled sharply and set the glass of brandy down with a clink. "Very well," he said, his voice quieter now, almost weary. "You are right to some extent. I knew about Lydia's plans, but I had hoped to stop it before it came to this. Lydia has always been difficult. She's reckless, and I feared she would drag Emily into something foolish. That girl, Miss Dawson, was far too young to make such a decision. I warned Lydia against it." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "But Lydia went ahead with it anyway, and now Miss Dawson is missing." Lord Hargrave's face twisted with frustration. "Lydia never listens. She's always been headstrong. I tried to keep her from running away, from dragging Miss Dawson into her foolish schemes. But I never wanted this." "Then why didn't you intervene that night, Lord Hargrave?" Holmes pressed, his voice unwavering. "Why didn't you stop them? Why didn't you stop Lydia when you knew what she was planning?" Hargrave's eyes darkened, a shadow passing over his face. He rose from his chair, pacing the room in agitation. "I did what I could. I had my own obligations. I couldn't just throw everything aside to prevent a foolish elopement. And Lydia is not a child. She's a grown woman who makes her own choices. I couldn't control her anymore." Holmes's gaze never left him. "And what of the man in the garden? The one who ordered Lydia to leave when she arrived to meet Emily? Did you know of him?" Hargrave froze, his back stiffening. His eyes widened, but his face betrayed no other emotion. "I don't know what you're talking about. What man? There's no one else involved in this." Holmes stepped forward, cutting him off. "We have evidence, Lord Hargrave. Evidence that suggests a man was waiting for Lydia that night. Someone who clearly had control over the situation. He told Lydia to leave, to stop searching for Miss Dawson. That man is our link between the disappearance and your niece's sudden change of heart." Lord Hargrave's lips curled into a tight, almost imperceptible smile. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. There was something sinister behind it. He slowly walked to the window, his back to us. "You're asking the wrong questions, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice soft but filled with a kind of dark amusement. "The question you should be asking is not who took Emily, but why. The answers you seek are not in the garden or the estate. They're much closer than you think." Holmes stood motionless, his expression unreadable, but I could see the shift in his demeanor. He was beginning to understand something we had missed. A new thread had been woven into the case, and the end was drawing nearer. But Lord Hargrave's cryptic words hung in the air like a final warning. The game was changing, and it was no longer just about finding the missing maid. There was something far more dangerous at play, something hidden beneath the layers of family secrets and forgotten promises. The cryptic smile Lord Hargrave gave us as he turned away from the window was unsettling. He had said something that cut through the fog of uncertainty we'd been navigating. The answers you seek are not in the garden or the estate. They're much closer than you think. His words echoed in my mind as we left the study, and Holmes, unusually quiet, seemed lost in thought. The moment we stepped out into the hallway, Holmes's pace slowed, and I knew that his mind was already sifting through the layers of this case. Something in Hargrave's demeanor had shifted, something that suggested he was withholding more than he'd let on. But the question remained, what was he trying to obscure? "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice low, as though he were speaking to himself. "There's a deeper game at play here, one that extends far beyond Lydia's rebellious desire to escape with Emily Dawson. We've been looking for the wrong answers, in the wrong places." I stopped, looking at him with raised eyebrows. "What do you mean, Holmes?" He didn't answer immediately, but I could see his eyes narrowing the way they always did when he was piecing together a web of facts. "I suspect that the man in the garden was not merely a stranger or an unknown accomplice. No, he was someone with direct access to Lydia, someone close enough to influence her." My mind raced, considering the possible suspects. But if it's someone close to Lydia, then why wouldn't she have confided in us? Why keep such an important detail hidden? Holmes's lips thinned as he looked down the hallway. "Because, Watson, the man who spoke to Lydia in the garden wasn't just a random figure. He was someone she trusted, someone who has been playing a far larger role in this drama than we've realized. We must focus on the people closest to her. It is time we re-examine the staff, particularly those who interact with Lydia and her movements." It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the weight of his deduction began to settle around us. Lydia Hargrave, despite her outward poise, had been influenced, or perhaps even manipulated by someone close to her, someone who likely knew her vulnerabilities. Could it be someone within her own household, a confidant who had played on her desires for freedom, steering her toward a decision that would lead to chaos? We made our way to the servants' quarters again, but this time our approach was more targeted. Instead of casting a wide net, Holmes focused on those who had been more directly involved with Lydia. It was clear now that Miss Dawson's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much darker, something deeply rooted in the fabric of the Hargrave household. Our first stop was the housekeeper, Mrs. Forsyth, whom we had already spoken to. Her earlier information about Lydia's secretive behavior and Emily's increasing distraction still seemed relevant. We found her in the kitchen, where she was busy overseeing the preparation of the evening meal. The warmth of the room did little to ease the growing chill of suspicion that had settled over me. "Mrs. Forsyth," Holmes said, his tone gentle but firm, "we need to discuss Lydia again. I believe she has been involved in something far more dangerous than a simple elopement. We need to understand the dynamics of her relationship with the staff, and I believe you can provide us with the clarity we need." She glanced up, her expression guarded, but she nodded in understanding. "I've already told you all I know, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly, setting the silver tray she had been polishing down on the counter. "Lydia and Emily were close, yes. They shared a bond, but it was nothing I hadn't seen before. Young women often form friendships that go beyond their station, and it was harmless enough." Holmes leaned forward, his voice low but insistent. "But it wasn't harmless, Mrs. Forsyth. There was more to it. Emily Dawson didn't simply disappear on her own. Lydia was involved, and I suspect you know more about their secretive behavior than you've let on. It's important that you tell us everything." For a long moment Mrs. Forsyth did not speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she fiddled with the edge of her apron. Then, as if weighing a decision, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure at first, but now that it's come to this, I'll tell you. There's a man, an acquaintance of Lydia's. I've seen him around the house a few times. I don't know his name, but he always came at night after everyone else had retired. He was different, too smooth, too polished for someone of his station, and he was always seen leaving late, usually around the same time Lydia would disappear for one of her walks." I exchanged a glance with Holmes, whose eyes were already alight with understanding. A man visiting Lydia in secret. "And this is the same man who met her in the garden the night Miss Dawson vanished?" Mrs. Forsyth nodded, her face pale. "I think so. Yes. He was the only one who could have influenced her like that. She wouldn't listen to anyone else, but when he spoke, she followed him without hesitation." Holmes's mind was already working, rapidly sifting through the new information. "This man, Mrs. Forsyth, did you ever see him speak to anyone else? Did anyone else seem aware of his presence?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Not openly, no. But I did catch a glimpse of him once, speaking to Lord Hargrave in the study. They were talking quietly, but I'm sure they were discussing Lydia. I didn't dare to listen in too closely, but something about their exchange seemed important." Holmes nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "That's it, Watson. The final piece. Lord Hargrave's cryptic words now make sense. He's been playing us all along. This man, this acquaintance, is tied directly to Lydia's disappearance, and more importantly to her manipulation." Mrs. Forsyth looked from one of us to the other, her face stricken with fear. "What does this mean, Mr. Holmes? Will Miss Dawson be found?" Holmes straightened, his resolve clear. "It means we're getting closer. We're about to uncover a much darker truth, and when we do, it will all come crashing down." With that, we thanked Mrs. Forsyth and left the kitchen, the weight of the new revelation settling heavily between us. We now had a name to search for, and our next move would be to uncover the identity of this mysterious man and the true extent of his influence over the Hargraves. This case, it seemed, was far from over. The closer we got to the truth, the more it seemed to slip further out of our grasp. As we left Mrs. Forsyth, Holmes was unusually quiet, his mind clearly running through the new piece of the puzzle we had uncovered. The image of the man, the stranger who had been coming to the Hargrave estate under the cover of night, loomed large now. He was the key, the one who had influenced Lydia, the one who had orchestrated Miss Dawson's disappearance. But who was he, and what exactly did Lord Hargrave know about him? Holmes's pace quickened as we made our way toward the study, where we hoped to confront Lord Hargrave with this new information. Every step felt heavier, laden with the weight of unspoken answers, as though we were closing in on a secret so tightly held that the very act of uncovering it might cause everything to collapse. When we arrived at the study, we found Lord Hargrave standing by the large mahogany desk, staring out the window into the misty garden. He didn't turn when we entered, but we could see his shoulders stiffen, a subtle sign that he was aware of our presence. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice smoother now, as though he had regained some of his composure. "I trust you have made some headway in your investigation." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Lord Hargrave, we've discovered more than you seem willing to admit. We know about the man who visited your niece in secret. We know he's been influencing her, guiding her actions, and we know he was there the night Miss Dawson disappeared." Lord Hargrave's face tightened, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw a flicker of something. Fear, perhaps, cross his features. He turned slowly, his posture now rigid, his eyes dark. "I don't know what you're talking about, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice a bit more strained than before. "Lydia's personal matters are her own. You are mistaken if you think I had any knowledge of this. Man you keep referring to, I've already told you everything you need to know." Holmes didn't waver. "I don't think you understand, Lord Hargrave. You've been lying to us from the start. You know this man, and I suspect you know far more than you're letting on. He's been coming to your estate for weeks, influencing your niece, and now Miss Dawson is missing. You were the one who allowed this to happen." Hargrave's eyes flashed with anger, and he took a step forward, his voice rising. "You don't know what you're talking about. You think you understand what's going on here, but you don't. I did what I could. Lydia is my niece, but she's not a child anymore. I cannot control her every move." Holmes remained unmoved, his gaze sharp and focused. "You're lying, Lord Hargrave. This man, whoever he is, has been manipulating you, Lydia, and now Miss Dawson. You allowed it to happen, and now you're trying to cover your tracks." There was a long, tense silence. Hargrave's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might snap. But then, with a deep sigh, he seemed to deflate, the fight leaving him as quickly as it had come. "You think I don't know what's at stake?" His voice was quieter now, as though he had resigned himself to whatever was coming. "I never wanted this to happen. But Lydia, she's been seeing him for months. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the way she was acting, I couldn't ignore it. She was changing. And then Emily got involved. I tried to stop them, but it was too late." Holmes's eyes narrowed further. "This man, who is he, Lord Hargrave? And what did he want with your niece?" Hargrave's gaze shifted to the window, his eyes distant as though searching for an answer beyond the glass. "His name is Robert Whitmore. He's a distant relative, but not one I speak of often. He's a man who's always been after money, after power. I tried to keep him away from Lydia, but she was enamored with him. She thought he could offer her a life outside of this house, a life where she could be free. But I knew what he was really after. He's been using her for his own gain, and Emily was a means to an end. Using her for what?" I asked, unable to keep the edge of disbelief from my voice. "What could he possibly want with her?" Lord Hargrave's face twisted in disgust. "Whitmore has debts, Watson. Gambling debts, among others. He came here looking for a way out, and he saw Lydia as his way to secure his future. He knew that if he could get her to run away with him, if he could convince her that they could live a life of freedom, she would inherit part of the family fortune when I passed. He wanted her money, her connections, everything that could elevate him from his pitiful existence." Holmes's expression remained unchanged, but his voice was heavy with the weight of what we had uncovered. "And Miss Dawson? How did she fit into this?" Hargrave's eyes darkened. "She was an obstacle. Whitmore couldn't move forward with his plans as long as she was around. She was a simple maid, but she was fiercely loyal to Lydia. When he realized Emily was too attached to Lydia, too protective of her, he decided she had to be removed. It all clicked into place. The midnight carriage, the secrecy, the man in the garden. Robert Whitmore had been orchestrating the whole thing. He had used Lydia as a pawn, and once Emily became a problem, he took matters into his own hands. Holmes's voice was calm, but laced with menace. "You let this happen, Lord Hargrave. You let your niece be manipulated, and you allowed Miss Dawson to be taken from us." Hargrave looked defeated now, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his brandy glass. "I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to lose Lydia, but I couldn't stop her. She was already in too deep. And then, when I realized what Whitmore was doing, it was too late. Emily was gone, and I didn't know how to fix it." Holmes's gaze softened just a fraction, his voice almost sympathetic. "You let it go too far, Lord Hargrave. Now we must fix it. But first we must find Robert Whitmore. He is the key to all of this." Lord Hargrave didn't argue. He simply nodded, resigned to the truth of his involvement. The pieces were falling into place. Robert Whitmore, the man who had manipulated everyone involved, was the true architect of Miss Dawson's disappearance. And now the clock was ticking. We needed to find him before he vanished once more into the shadows. Taking the answers we so desperately needed with him, the revelation of Robert Whitmore's involvement hit with the force of a revelation. Yet, even with the pieces now fitting together, there was still much left unsaid. Lord Hargrave, though he had admitted the extent of his negligence, was still a key figure in the labyrinth of lies and half-truths that had entangled Lydia, Emily, and the rest of the household. Whitmore, with his cunning manipulation, had spun a web so tight that it was nearly impossible to untangle without exposing the darkest parts of the Hargrave family. Holmes, always steady in his pursuit of the truth, seemed to regard the situation with a quiet intensity. He had the answers now, but they were not enough to bring the mystery to a close. Whitmore was the central figure, but where was he? And how could we bring him to justice? "We must act quickly, Watson," Holmes said, his voice even but filled with urgency. "The longer Whitmore remains in hiding, the harder it will be to catch him. He's a man who has learned how to cover his tracks. His gambling debts, his schemes, his manipulations, they all point to someone who is accustomed to living in the shadows." "I agree, Holmes," I replied, still digesting the complexity of it all. "But where do we begin? Whitmore has been careful, and now after all this he must realize that we're closing in on him." Holmes's eyes gleamed with a sharpness that indicated his mind was already turning. "We begin by using what he thinks he can control. His desire for wealth, his desperation for escape. I have a hunch, Watson, and I believe it's time we put it to the test. We wasted no time." Holmes's plan, though vague in its outline, was grounded in one undeniable truth. Robert Whitmore was a man who sought something more. He had sought Lydia's inheritance, but there were other means by which a man like him could be lured out. The estate, the connections, the money. These were things that Whitmore could never fully relinquish. And it was this weakness that Holmes intended to exploit. By the time we arrived at the outskirts of the estate, it was late in the evening, and the first hints of the full moon's light began to break through the dense fog. Holmes's eyes scanned the area with an almost predatory precision, his every step measured and purposeful. "I've arranged for a meeting with someone who can help us track down Whitmore," Holmes said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet excitement. "We'll use Hargrave's connections to set a trap. He'll bite, I'm sure of it." We approached the secluded part of the grounds, a small isolated building that had been used by the estate for various purposes over the years. Holmes had chosen this spot carefully, knowing that it was remote enough for our plan to go undetected, while still close enough to the main house for us to remain within, striking distance if anything went. "Hooray!" The air was thick with anticipation as Holmes spoke softly, arranging the final details of our plan. He had carefully orchestrated a scenario in which Whitmore would believe that an important transaction involving the Hargrave family fortune was to take place that very evening. The details were designed to lure him out, too tempting for a man like Whitmore to resist. As we set the stage, a figure emerged from the shadows. Hargrave's trusted solicitor, a man by the name of Mr. Armstrong. His presence confirmed that everything was in motion. Armstrong had been informed that Whitmore would likely appear, drawn by the promise of money and the notion that the Hargrave family was finally ready to negotiate. But unbeknownst to him, it was all a ruse designed to expose the truth. The night dragged on in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the distant echo of the estate. Holmes remained unfazed, his eyes flicking between the darkened paths leading up to the building. He was a man who could wait, knowing that every second of silence brought us closer to Whitmore's inevitable arrival. Finally, the unmistakable sound of hooves crunching on gravel reached our ears. It was faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, the weight of what was about to happen settling into the pit of my stomach. "He's here," Holmes muttered, his voice low and filled with anticipation. We positioned ourselves near the edge of the building, where we could observe the entrance without being seen. The hooves grew louder, the sound of a carriage now unmistakable, drawing closer. The moon's light reflected off the glossy surface of the black carriage as it rounded the corner. Coming to a stop just outside the building, for a long moment, there was silence. Then the carriage door opened, and a tall figure stepped out. Robert Whitmore. He was dressed in dark, elegant clothing, his face half shadowed by the brim of his hat. He paused for a moment, scanning the area with an almost predatory awareness before stepping forward. His movements were deliberate, purposeful. Holmes and I exchanged a brief look, our position now secure. There was no turning back now. We had the man who had caused so much destruction. His time had come. Whitmore moved toward the door where Mr. Armstrong stood waiting, ready to play his part in the ruse. He approached with a measured confidence, though the tension in his step was evident. He had been drawn in by the promise of a meeting with Hargrave, perhaps thinking that his debts would be settled or that a portion of the inheritance would be granted to him. But he had walked right into our trap. Just as Whitmore was about to reach for the door, Holmes stepped out from the shadows, his voice ringing through the air. "Robert Whitmore," he said coldly, his tone filled with the weight of authority. "You're under arrest for the kidnapping of Emily Dawson and for the manipulation of Lydia Hargrave." Whitmore froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Holmes," he muttered, his voice laced with contempt. "You think you can stop me now?" "We already have," Holmes replied, his voice unyielding. The game is over. The trap had been set, and the man who had carefully pulled every string to ensure his success was now caught in his own web. Whitmore stood motionless, his breath catching for just a fraction of a second before his eyes darkened with a venomous glint. The sight of Holmes, steady and unyielding, seemed to erase any doubt from his mind. He was trapped, and he knew it. There was no escape from the net that had been carefully woven around him, no twisting of the facts or manipulation of the truth that could save him now. Holmes stepped closer, his presence commanding, his voice quiet but sharp as he addressed the man who had set this entire tragedy into motion. "You are Robert Whitmore, a man driven by greed, deceit, and a ruthless ambition that has cost a young woman her freedom and another her life. But your schemes have finally caught up with you." Whitmore's lips curled into a sneer, his face contorting with the frustration of being outmaneuvered. "You think you've won, Holmes? You think you can undo everything I've worked for?" Holmes's gaze did not falter. "You've worked for nothing, Whitmore. What you've built is a house of lies, and those walls will crumble under the weight of your own actions. You thought you could manipulate Lydia, use her for your own gain. You thought you could control Miss Dawson, remove her from the picture when she became inconvenient. But in the end, it's you who is trapped." Whitmore's eyes darted between Holmes and the few men who had been quietly observing from the shadows, his accomplices, now thoroughly aware that their part in this was done. His gaze softened, his bravado slipping away as reality settled in. "What will you do now, Holmes?" Whitmore spat, his voice heavy with defeat. "You think you can ruin me with your petty accusations? Do you know what this will mean for you? The truth will be twisted. They'll never believe you." Holmes's eyes never left him. "The truth, Whitmore, is already in motion. Lydia's confession will be the final piece of this puzzle, and Miss Dawson's whereabouts will be known. You won't escape this time." Whitmore's face fell, his features losing their arrogant edge. There was a pause, just long enough for the realization to fully settle over him that he was beaten. The intricate web he had spun was unraveling, and all his machinations were for naught. Holmes turned to Mr. Armstrong, the solicitor who had played his part in the trap. "Mr. Armstrong, I trust you have the necessary documents prepared to ensure Whitmore's arrest is formalized." Armstrong nodded, his expression unreadable. "Everything is in order, Mr. Holmes. The authorities will be informed immediately, and the rest of the legal process will follow swiftly." Whitmore, now bound and restrained, was led toward the carriage. His eyes, once filled with confidence and menace, now carried only the weight of a man who knew his time had run out. As he was escorted away, he muttered one final bitter remark as if trying to regain some semblance of his former bravado. "You've won nothing, Holmes," he growled. "You may have exposed me, but there are others who will carry on. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." Holmes did not respond, his gaze fixed firmly on the departing figure of the man who had caused so much pain and distress. The case, though now solved, had revealed darker currents beneath the surface of a family that had once seemed untouchable. As the carriage disappeared into the night, Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable but his voice steady. "It's done, Watson. Whitmore will answer for his crimes, and the Hargrave family will have to reckon with the damage caused by their own negligence and greed." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered. The investigation had ended, but the toll it had taken on everyone involved was not something that could be easily repaired. Lydia Hargrave, for all her beauty and charm, had been a pawn in a game far larger than she had ever realized. And Miss Dawson, whose loyalty had been her downfall, had been caught in the crossfire of a bitter, twisted battle between those who sought power and those who sought freedom. "Do you think," I asked cautiously, "that Lydia will ever fully understand the consequences of her actions?" Holmes turned to me, his gaze distant as he considered the question. "I think she will, Watson. In time she will understand. But whether that understanding will bring any peace, I cannot say. Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we must learn in silence." We stood there for a moment, the fog swirling around us, the quiet of the night broken only by the distant sound of the carriage's wheels on the gravel. The investigation was over, but the mystery of human nature, of the choices we make and the paths we walk, remained. "Let's return to Baker Street," Holmes said, his voice soft but final. "There is little more to be done here. And we've earned a rest." As we walked away from the Hargrave estate, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the case settling on my shoulders. It had been a long and difficult journey, but in the end justice had been served. And yet, as always with Holmes, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction that came not from the victory itself, but from the process, uncovering the layers, finding the truth hidden beneath the surface, and knowing that once again, justice had triumphed over the darkness, and for once, I felt the true weight of the work we had done together.